The dust cloud stretched for miles behind Jake Morrison as his horse Thunder galloped across the barren landscape of New Mexico Territory. The year was 1883, and the scorching sun beat down mercilessly on his weathered face. His dark eyes scanned the horizon constantly, searching for any sign of the men who had been hunting him for the past 3 weeks. Jake was not a criminal, though the wanted posters plastered across every town from Santa Fe to Albuquerque suggested otherwise. The bounty on his head read $5,000 for cattle rustling and murder. But Jake knew the truth was far more dangerous than any lie printed on those yellowed papers. 3 months earlier, Jake had been working as a ranch hand for the wealthy cattle baron Edmund Blackwood. The Blackwood Ranch sprawled across thousands of acres of prime grazing land, and Edmund was known throughout the territory as a fair but firm employer. Jake had been grateful for the steady work, especially after losing his own small homestead to drought the previous year. Everything changed on that fateful night in July when Jake couldn't sleep and decided to take a walk around the ranch grounds. The moon was full, casting an eerie silver light across the landscape. As he wandered near the main house, he heard voices coming from Edmund's study. The window was slightly open, and Jake found himself drawn closer by the urgent tone of the conversation. What he heard that night would haunt him forever. Edmund Blackwood was not the honorable rancher everyone believed him to be. Instead, he was the mastermind behind a brutal scheme that involved stealing cattle from small homesteaders, murdering anyone who resisted, and then claiming their land through false documents and corrupt officials. Jake listened in horror as Edmund discussed his latest targets with his foreman, Bull Mackenzie, a massive man with cold gray eyes and hands that had clearly seen violence. They spoke casually about families they had destroyed, children left orphaned, and elderly couples who had mysteriously disappeared after refusing to sell their property. The most shocking revelation came when Edmund pulled out a detailed map showing planned railroad routes that had not yet been made public. The government had secretly surveyed the territory, and certain pieces of land would soon become incredibly valuable when the railroad arrived. Edmund had been using his connections in Washington to obtain this insider information, then systematically eliminating anyone who stood in his way of acquiring those strategic properties. Jake's blood ran cold when he heard his own name mentioned. Edmund suspected that Jake had been asking too many questions about the recent disappearances in the area. Bull Mackenzie suggested they deal with Jake the same way they had handled other problems. Edmund agreed, instructing Bull to make it look like an accident during the next cattle drive. Realizing his life was in immediate danger, Jake carefully backed away from the window. He knew he had to escape immediately, but he also understood that simply running would not be enough. Edmund Blackwood's influence extended throughout the territory. Local sheriffs, judges, and even territorial officials were either on his payroll or too intimidated to oppose him. Jake spent the rest of the night gathering evidence. He quietly searched the ranch office and found documents that confirmed everything he had overheard. There were forged property deeds, correspondence with corrupt officials, and most damning of all, a detailed ledger that recorded payments to various individuals for services ranging from false testimony to murder. Among the papers, Jake discovered something that made his heart race. His own father, who had died 5 years earlier in what everyone believed was a random attack by bandits, was listed in the ledger. The entry showed a payment to Bull Mackenzie for eliminating a homesteader who had refused to sell his property. Jake realized that his father had been murdered by the very men he now worked for, and that his family's tragic loss was just another calculated move in Edmund Blackwood's ruthless expansion. As dawn approached, Jake carefully photographed the most important documents using a small camera he had borrowed from the ranch's surveyor. He then returned everything to its original position, saddled Thunder, and rode away from the ranch as if heading out for a normal day's work. His plan was to reach the nearest large town and present his evidence to federal authorities who might be beyond Edmund's influence. However, Jake had underestimated how quickly Edmund would discover that someone had been in his office. By noon that same day, a group of armed riders was pursuing Jake across the desert. The chase had been relentless. Edmund's men seemed to anticipate Jake's every move. suggesting they had help from local law enforcement. Jake had been forced to avoid all towns and settlements, surviving on what little food and water he could find or steal from abandoned homesteads. Now, 3 weeks into his desperate flight, Jake was running out of options. Thunder was exhausted, his own supplies were nearly gone, and the pursuing riders seemed to be getting closer with each passing day. The irony was not lost on him that he was now living the life of an outlaw despite being innocent of any crime. As the sun began to set on another day of hard riding, Jake spotted something that gave him hope. In the distance, barely visible against the darkening sky, he could see the lights of a town. But this was not just any town. According to his mental map of the territory, this had to be Redemption Creek, a settlement known for its independent spirit and resistance to outside influence. Redemption Creek had been founded by former soldiers and homesteaders who had banded together for mutual protection against both Apache raids and corrupt officials. The town's sheriff, Tom Bradley, was rumored to be one of the few lawmen in the territory who could not be bought or intimidated. If Jake could reach Sheriff Bradley and convince him to listen to his story, he might finally have a chance to expose Edmund Blackwood's crimes. But getting to Redemption Creek would not be easy. Jake could see dust clouds on the horizon behind him, indicating that his pursuers were still close. He would have to ride hard through the night and hope that Thunder had enough strength left for one final sprint to safety. As darkness fell across the desert, Jake urged his faithful horse forward toward the distant lights of Redemption Creek. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit grew closer, and he knew that the next few hours would determine whether he lived to tell his story or died as a wanted man in the lonely wilderness of New Mexico territory. The wind carried the sound of gunshots from somewhere behind him, and Jake realized that Edmund's men were no longer trying to capture him alive. They had orders to silence him permanently, regardless of the consequences. With this grim understanding, Jake leaned low over Thunder's neck and prepared for the most dangerous ride of his life. Thunder's hooves thundered against the hard-packed earth as Jake pushed his horse to its absolute limit. The lights of Redemption Creek grew brighter with each passing minute. But the sound of pursuit behind him was growing louder as well. Jake could hear the distinctive whistle that Bull Mackenzie used to coordinate his men during cattle drives, and he knew that the net was closing around him. Just as the first buildings of Redemption Creek came into view, disaster struck. Thunder stumbled on a prairie dog hole and went down hard, throwing Jake from the saddle. Both horse and rider crashed to the ground in a tangle of dust and pain. Jake rolled quickly to avoid Thunder's flailing hooves and immediately checked his faithful companion for injuries. Thunder had badly injured his front leg and could barely stand. Jake's heart sank as he realized that his horse would not be able to carry him any further. With the sounds of approaching riders echoing across the desert, Jake made the hardest decision of his life. He stripped the saddle from Thunder and sent the injured horse limping toward a nearby creek where he would at least have water. Jake shouldered his saddlebags containing the precious photographic evidence and began running toward Redemption Creek on foot. The town was still over 2 miles away, and he could hear the pursuit getting closer with every step. His lungs burned from the thin desert air, and his legs felt like lead, but he forced himself to keep moving. When Jake was still a mile from town, 6 riders burst over a ridge behind him. Bull Mackenzie's massive frame was unmistakable even in the moonlight, and Jake could see the glint of drawn weapons in the hands of all the pursuers. They had seen him and were closing the distance rapidly. Jake dove behind a large boulder just as the first shots rang out. Bullets whined off the rocks around him, sending chips of stone flying in all directions. He drew his own pistol, knowing that his 6 shots would be no match for the firepower arrayed against him, but determined to sell his life dearly if necessary. "Morrison," Bull Mackenzie's voice boomed across the desert. "You've caused us enough trouble. Come out with your hands up, and we'll make it quick." Jake remained silent, knowing that any response would only help them pinpoint his location. Instead, he carefully studied the terrain around him, looking for any advantage he could find. The boulder that sheltered him was part of a larger rock formation that extended toward the town. If he could work his way through the rocks without being seen, he might be able to get close enough to Redemption Creek for help to arrive. As Jake began his careful movement through the rocks, he heard something that made his blood run cold. More riders were approaching from the direction of Redemption Creek. For a moment, he feared that Edmund's corruption had extended even to this independent town, and that he was about to be caught between two groups of enemies. But then he heard a voice that filled him with hope. "This is Sheriff Tom Bradley of Redemption Creek. You men are trespassing on town property. Identify yourselves and state your business." Bull Mackenzie's response was immediate and hostile. "This is official territorial business, Sheriff. We're pursuing a dangerous criminal, and we'll thank you to stay out of our way." "I'll need to see some paperwork," Sheriff Bradley replied calmly. "And I'll need to verify any claims about criminals with my own eyes." Jake could hear the frustration in Bull Mackenzie's voice as he responded, "We don't have time for this bureaucratic nonsense. The man we're after is a murderer and a cattle thief." "Then you won't mind taking him back to town for a proper trial," Sheriff Bradley said. "In Redemption Creek, we believe in due process." The standoff continued for several tense minutes, with neither side backing down. Jake realized that this might be his only chance to reach safety. He began working his way through the rocks toward Sheriff Bradley's position, moving as quietly as possible to avoid drawing attention from Bull Mackenzie's men. When Jake was within 50 yards of the sheriff's group, he called out carefully, "Sheriff Bradley, I'm Jake Morrison, and I have information about corruption that goes all the way to the territorial government." The response was immediate chaos. Bull Mackenzie's men opened fire on Jake's position while simultaneously trying to intimidate Sheriff Bradley's deputies into withdrawing. But the lawmen of Redemption Creek were not easily intimidated, and they returned fire with disciplined accuracy. Jake used the confusion to sprint the final distance to Sheriff Bradley's position. The sheriff was a tall, lean man with steel-gray hair and eyes that missed nothing. Despite the gunfight raging around them, he looked at Jake with calm assessment. "You better have a good story, son," Sheriff Bradley said as he handed Jake a rifle. "Because those men seem mighty determined to silence you." "I have evidence," Jake gasped, patting his saddlebags. "Photographs and documents that prove Edmund Blackwood has been murdering homesteaders and stealing their land using inside information about railroad routes." Sheriff Bradley's expression grew grim. He had heard rumors about suspicious land deals and mysterious disappearances, but he had never had any solid evidence to act upon. If Jake was telling the truth, this could be the break he had been waiting for. The gunfight continued for another 20 minutes before Bull Mackenzie realized that his position was hopeless. Sheriff Bradley's deputies had superior cover and were clearly experienced fighters. Moreover, the sounds of the battle were beginning to draw curious townspeople, and Bull knew that witnesses would complicate Edmund's plans. "This isn't over, Morrison," Bull Mackenzie shouted as he and his men began withdrawing. "You can't hide behind that sheriff forever." As the sound of retreating hoofbeats faded into the distance, Sheriff Bradley turned his full attention to Jake. "All right, son. Let's hear your story, and it better be good, because I just risked the lives of my men for you." Jake spent the next hour laying out everything he had discovered. He showed Sheriff Bradley the photographs he had taken of Edmund's documents, explained what he had overheard that night at the ranch, and revealed the devastating truth about his own father's murder. Sheriff Bradley examined the evidence carefully, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When Jake finished his account, the sheriff was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications of what he had heard. "This is bigger than I thought," Sheriff Bradley finally said. "If what you're telling me is true, Edmund Blackwood has been operating a criminal enterprise that involves multiple murders, systematic land theft, and corruption of government officials. But proving it is going to be dangerous work." Jake nodded grimly. "I know the risks, Sheriff, but I can't let him continue destroying innocent families. My father deserves justice, and so do all the others who have died because of Edmund's greed." Sheriff Bradley made his decision. "All right, Jake Morrison. I'm going to take you into protective custody while we build a case against Edmund Blackwood. But I want you to understand something. Once we start down this road, there's no turning back. Edmund has money, influence, and dangerous men working for him. He'll do everything in his power to stop us." "I understand," Jake replied. "But I'd rather die fighting for the truth than spend the rest of my life running from lies." As they rode toward Redemption Creek, Jake felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had finally found someone willing to listen to his story and help him seek justice. But he also knew that the real battle was just beginning. Edmund Blackwood would not give up easily, and the revelation of his crimes would send shockwaves throughout the territory. Behind them, in the darkness of the desert, Bull Mackenzie was already riding hard toward the Blackwood Ranch to report his failure to capture Jake. The war for justice was about to begin in earnest, and both sides knew that only one could survive the coming confrontation. The next morning brought news that chilled Jake to the bone. A rider arrived in Redemption Creek with word that Edmund Blackwood was mobilizing every man he could hire throughout the territory. The cattle baron was no longer trying to hide his criminal activities. Instead, he was preparing for an all-out war to eliminate anyone who threatened his empire. Sheriff Bradley called an emergency town meeting in the saloon. The people of Redemption Creek had always prided themselves on their independence, but they had never faced a threat like Edmund Blackwood. As Jake stood before the assembled townspeople and told his story, he could see fear and determination warring in their faces. "Folks," Sheriff Bradley said after Jake finished speaking, "we have a choice to make. We can turn Jake over to Edmund's men and hope they leave us alone, or we can stand up for what's right and face the consequences." An elderly rancher named Samuel Hayes stood up slowly. Jake recognized him as one of the original founders of Redemption Creek. "Sheriff," Samuel said in a voice weathered by years of hard living, "my own brother disappeared 6 months ago after refusing to sell his land to Blackwood. I always wondered what really happened to him. Now I know." One by one, other townspeople began sharing their own stories. A widow, whose husband had died in a suspicious accident after discovering Blackwood's men on his property. A young farmer whose family had been driven off their homestead by mysterious cattle rustlers. A merchant whose wagon had been attacked after he refused to extend credit to Blackwood's operation. The pattern became clear as more stories were told. Edmund Blackwood had been systematically terrorizing the entire region for years, but his victims had been too scattered and frightened to connect the dots. Jake's evidence finally provided the missing pieces of a horrific puzzle. "I say we fight," declared Maria Santos, the owner of the town's boarding house. "My family came here to escape corruption and violence in Mexico. I won't let another tyrant drive us from our homes." The townspeople voted unanimously to stand with Jake and Sheriff Bradley against Edmund Blackwood. But they knew they would need more than courage to survive what was coming. Sheriff Bradley sent riders to other independent communities throughout the territory, spreading word about Edmund's crimes and calling for allies in the coming fight. While they waited for responses, Jake worked with Sheriff Bradley to prepare the town's defenses. Redemption Creek was well positioned for a defensive battle, with natural barriers on 3 sides and good fields of fire from the main street. But they were still outnumbered by at least 3 to 1. 3 days after the town meeting, Edmund Blackwood himself arrived at the outskirts of Redemption Creek with over 50 armed men. The cattle baron rode slowly down the main street, his cold eyes taking in every detail of the town's defenses. He was a distinguished-looking man in his 50s, with silver hair and an expensive suit that seemed out of place in the dusty frontier town. Sheriff Bradley met Edmund in the middle of the street, flanked by Jake and 2 deputies. The tension was so thick, it could be cut with a knife as the 2 groups faced each other. "Sheriff Bradley," Edmund said in a cultured voice that carried clearly in the desert air, "I believe you have something that belongs to me, a certain ranch hand who stole valuable property and murdered one of my men. I have a man under my protection who has provided evidence of serious crimes." Sheriff Bradley replied calmly, "If you have charges to bring against him, you're welcome to present them to a proper court." Edmund's facade of civility slipped slightly. "There are no proper courts in this God-forsaken territory, Sheriff. There's only power, and I have more of it than you can imagine." "Maybe so," Jake said, stepping forward, "but you don't have the truth, and that's what really matters." Edmund's eyes locked onto Jake with pure hatred. Truth is whatever the strongest man says it is, boy. And you're about to learn just how weak the truth really is. The standoff continued for several more minutes before Edmund and his men withdrew to make camp outside of town. Everyone knew that the real confrontation would come at dawn, when Edmund would try to take Jake by force. That night, Jake couldn't sleep. He walked the streets of Redemption Creek, checking the barricades and talking with the townspeople who had volunteered to fight alongside him. He was amazed by their courage and determination, but he was also racked with guilt about the danger he had brought to their doorstep. Sheriff Bradley found Jake sitting alone outside the jail, staring up at the stars. "Having second thoughts?" the sheriff asked. "Every minute," Jake admitted. "These people didn't ask for this fight. Maybe I should just surrender myself and end this before anyone else gets hurt." "You could do that," Sheriff Bradley agreed. "But then Edmund would kill you, destroy the evidence, and probably burn down half the town just to make sure no one talks about what happened here. Sometimes fighting is the only way to protect innocent people." As dawn approached, Jake took his position on the roof of the jail with a rifle and a clear view of the main street. Sheriff Bradley had positioned his fighters strategically throughout the town, turning every building into a potential fortress. The plan was simple: make Edmund's attack so costly that he would be forced to withdraw. The attack came just as the sun cleared the horizon. Edmund's men charged into town from 3 directions simultaneously, expecting to overwhelm the defenders with sheer numbers. But they had underestimated the determination and skill of Redemption Creek's people. The battle was fierce and chaotic. Jake found himself in the middle of the most intense fighting, as Edmund's men concentrated their efforts on reaching the jail where they believed he was hiding. But Jake had learned from his father's military service, and he moved constantly, appearing in different positions to harass the attackers and then disappearing before they could respond. The turning point came when reinforcements arrived from 2 neighboring communities that had received Sheriff Bradley's messages. These fresh fighters attacked Edmund's men from behind, creating confusion and panic in their ranks. Realizing that his position was hopeless, Edmund Blackwood made a desperate decision. He rode directly toward the jail, hoping to settle his score with Jake personally. But Jake was ready for him. The 2 men faced each other in the dusty street as the battle raged around them. Edmund drew his pistol with practiced speed, but Jake was faster. His shot took Edmund in the shoulder, spinning the cattle baron around and sending him crashing to the ground. As Edmund lay wounded in the dirt, Jake walked over and stood above him. "It's over," Jake said quietly. "The truth wins after all." Bull Mackenzie, seeing his boss defeated, called for a retreat. Edmund's surviving men fled into the desert, their criminal empire finally broken. In the weeks that followed, Jake's evidence led to a territorial investigation that exposed the full extent of Edmund Blackwood's crimes. Dozens of corrupt officials were arrested, and families of the murdered homesteaders finally received justice. The railroad, when it finally arrived, brought prosperity to communities that had survived Edmund's reign of terror. Edmund himself was tried and convicted of multiple murders and sentenced to hang. On the day of his execution, Jake watched from the crowd as the man who had destroyed so many lives finally paid for his crimes. Jake remained in Redemption Creek, where he was welcomed as a hero and eventually elected mayor. He married Maria Santos and helped build the town into one of the most prosperous communities in the territory. But he never forgot the lonely weeks he had spent riding by himself across the desert, carrying the truth that would eventually set an entire region free from tyranny. Sheriff Bradley kept Edmund's criminal ledger in his office as a reminder that justice, though sometimes slow in coming, would always prevail in the end. And on quiet nights, when the wind blew across the desert, the people of Redemption Creek would remember the young man who had risked everything to expose the savage secret that had nearly destroyed them all. The gallows that had been built for Jake's execution were eventually torn down. But the memory of his courage lived on in the stories told by parents to their children. In the harsh landscape of the American West, where survival often required compromise with evil, Jake Morrison had proven that sometimes one person with the truth could defeat an army of lies. Years later, when the railroad finally connected Redemption Creek to the rest of the growing nation, Jake would often ride out to the desert where his adventure had begun. He would think about his father, about the families that Edmund had destroyed, and about the responsibility that came with surviving when others had not. The West was changing rapidly, but the lessons Jake had learned during those desperate weeks remained constant. Truth was indeed powerful, but it required courage to unleash that power, and sometimes, when a man rode by himself against impossible odds, he could change the course of history itself.